Hello, everybody. Rita McGrath here with my new best friends, Geoff Tuff and Steve Goldbach. We're currently with Deloitte and have been the authors of a number of books, most recently this terrific book, Home, which I'm very proud to have a pre-publication copy of. And we're going to have a chat about that book, their work, the sort of arc of it, which I think is fascinating. But before we get into the books, I'd love to just hear about a project I was fascinated by that you guys did years ago. I think were you still at Monitor at the time? I'm not sure. And this was looking at corporate portfolios. And one of the big conclusions, and I cite this all the time in my classes, is if you think about sort of investments in the core, investments in kind of next generation core, and investments in what's really out there, that what you found really counterintuitively is that if you take the standard allocation, which is sort of 70, 20, 10, of what you have to spend on innovation, that the returns were actually the inverse of that. And I wonder if you would mind just spending a minute or two on that research, because I haven't had a chance to catch up with you on it in a long time.
And it has been a while, Rita. I mean, we did that research, probably 13, 14 years ago at this point. I think the article came out in HBR in 2012, 2013. I'm not remembering exactly. So needless to say, perhaps the data is going to be very different today. But back then, when we looked at it, as you point out, the purpose of the study that we did was to try to understand if there is a so-called optimal portfolio from a capital markets reward perspective. And we did discover that the 70-20-10 mix, core, adjacent, and transformational, was the average ideal portfolio structure, and that the return over a 3 to 5 year period was almost exactly the inverse. So 70% of the innovation returns came from those few big bold bets in the transformational space, 20 from the adjacent, and 10 from the core, which it kind of makes sense because it correlates somewhat with risk. But the reality, as we were then asked to come to a whole range of different companies, some of our clients, some who weren't our clients at the time, to actually look at their portfolios and understand what is their structure today, the thing we discovered is that the vast majority of big scaled companies weren't anywhere close to that optimal portfolio design. They were more like 95, 96, 97% of their spend and attention was focused on the core, all for very explainable reasons. But the key learning from that article was that it's all fine and dandy to study the great innovators out there for what the right portfolio structure is, but mainly because of rigid stage gate systems and this fluff belief that more ideas are better, or it's better to have more ideas, or you just pump through the pipeline. Everyone was wasting their time and effort just focused on those really, really small moves forward in the core. And we can dive into that in a lot more detail if you like. But as I say, things have changed. And though we haven't redone the study, we hypothesize that things are very different today.
But interestingly, Rita, the way in which that article, which I wasn't part of, so just to claim that Geoff and another colleague, Bansi Naji, wrote that piece. But the interesting thing, what led Geoff and I to Detonate, was actually how people were interpreting that work. And so we were very clear that, look, 70-20-10 is an average across lots of different industries, and depending on your situation, as you've well written, your competitive advantage, may or may not be more or less fleeting, based on the technology that you face, the technology disruptions that you face in your industry, your customers' behavior, what have you. Everybody who was interested in that piece started to apply it in a very rote way. So saying like they tried to get to 70-20-10 because that was perceived to be like some magic number that would work for every business. And that led us to the belief, it's like, look, it's actually best practices are a route to mediocrity if that's all you follow. And this became, what we were realizing was this became like yet another best practice that we can just, if we just apply it to our business, without the thinking of going back to like, what does the principles about this say and how do I apply it in my business in a unique way? That was like, okay, this is yet another thing. Like we just would like to blow up that whole mindset of, the way in which we apply learning to our businesses.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. And I would agree with you. When I go into companies and occasionally do an analysis of what's in their portfolio, and what you find is it's just a mess in there. And the root cause, I believe, is because we've got these four processes that get disconnected from each other. So there's your strategy process, and when that's done right, Ideally, it's pulling you into the future. Then your budgeting process, which is often done by a whole different group of people, and it's often anchoring you completely in the past, because where do we start with this year's budget? Well, of course, last year's budget, right? And so that's an anchor in the past. Then we've got the process by which portfolios are managed and governed, and that's a whole different group of people who are often not connected either to strategy or budgets. And then you have the process by which people feel they're going to get ahead in the company, and that's often a leftover from 4 strategies ago. So it's just a mess. And so I just love to come back.
You've just interconnected a bunch of ideas from Detonate all the way through Hone, actually.
Exactly.
So but what's interesting, and I'll pick up on one thing, and we should come back to how people get ahead, because that's at the root of Hone. But we wrote a whole piece on just the folly of the budgeting process in general in Detonate, and we just said, like, every budgeting process unfortunately works in the exact opposite way the world works, which is you start with an assumption about the market and what revenue you're going to get, and then you back into an assumption about, well, how much can I afford to spend given I'm going to get that revenue? And the problem with that, of course, is that revenue is not like preordained and allocated by competitor or anything like that. You spend costs so that you can earn revenue and then derive profits as the derivative of those things. And we start with revenue like it's like it grows on trees and we're just going to collect it. And then we can say, well, we can afford to spend that much. Like, it's just literally the opposite way the world works. And we like what the thing that runs through everything Geoff and I do is this idea of going back to first principles of what is it we're trying to do here, and calling attention to it. And it's like, how did we end up with this sort of process that doesn't reflect the core way business functions?
Oh, totally. So just to catch up our listeners on what we're talking about here. So this book, which is called Hone, and I will wave it around proudly, is the most recent product of these two gentlemen collaborating. But it's actually the third book in what you describe as kind of an unintentional trilogy. And so the first was Detonate, which I loved. I thought that was a great book. It was also kind of sassy, it was like,
it was a little edgy at the time, yeah. Little too edgy for some, given the title, and we can talk more about that. But
yeah. And then the second book was called Provoke, which was sort of, okay, once you've blown the thing up, how do you now raise a thought process about what do you do next? And this book, Hone, seems to be much calmer, much sort of more about small steps. And if you sort of start out with revolution and work your way through to what this book's about, I'm just fascinated by the evolution of the thought process. So maybe you'd like to expand on that.
Maybe you just touch, Rita, on two middle-aged gentlemen aging well over the course of the last 8 or 9 years and becoming more mellow. But so listen, the first thing we should just be quite clear about is when we set out to write Detonate, we didn't think there was a trilogy. We didn't know where we were going with it, but we did feel very strongly, as Steve said, that big-scaled, successful companies, which is the primary audience that we have in mind for our work, and they're the clients we work with in our day jobs, they were being held back by this belief that best practices work, by all the playbooks that have been established in the past. And we really did actually, we wanted to be a bit hyperbolic with the title Detonate to say you need to blow things up. But we've been very careful since then, and we tried to be careful in the book, maybe not careful enough, to say a detonation is not an explosion of everything. It's actually a very controlled demolition of a certain part of your business or a certain set of playbooks that you have in order to let the rest thrive. And we actually believe very strongly that, and going back actually to the article that you referenced that as Steve said, gave rise to Detonate, work in the core and innovation in the core is absolutely critical. We're not saying blow up your core business, because that's what actually gives you the right to play in the markets and to invest in more transformational innovations over time. But there are some things across your entire business system that do need to be blown up. So that was the core of what we did with Detonate. We took a little bit of breathing time after that. We had good reception to that book, but then we realized that it's all fine and dandy for two folks to come along and say blow up all the playbooks, but we didn't feel as though we had given enough guidance around, so what do you do next? And so Provoke, which came about 3.5, 4 years after Detonate, was all about this notion that yes, we operate in a world of uncertainty, but the reality is uncertainty resolves, or at least the vast majority of uncertainty resolves. Some metaphysical things, we don't know what happens at death and what have you, but at some point, a question of if turns into a question of when, or it just completely goes away. We all, or many probably remember Y2K and the great scare that our computers couldn't possibly flip from 1999 to 2000. Turns out that uncertainty just went away and we were just fine. But most other uncertainties do turn from being a question of if to when. And so the premise behind Provoke was if you can act early in that phase change from if to when, you can create advantage for yourself by influencing the way that the future unfolds. And that was at the heart of Provoke. Steve, I'll let you pick it up with Hone, and maybe you can talk about where the title came from, because that really was the original impetus for what we did in that.
Yeah, and Hone, Rita, was sort of our response to the reception, a generally positive reception from both Detonate and Provoke, but a lot of a desire to okay, so what do I do? How do I operationalize these ideas on a day-to-day basis? What are sort of the, as a leader, how do I run my thing? Okay, I can't just blow everything up every day. What do I need to do day in, day out? And so we wanted to write a book about how it is that we think leaders need to change their approach to leadership, and how they even think about themselves as a leader and the role of leaders. The inspiration for the title comes from a instance that I had with a chef friend of mine, Flannery Colton. And Flannery has been a private chef, and she's now a chef at the Sailing Collective. She's represented the United States in multiple different cooking competitions. She's an incredibly accomplished chef, and just has chosen to not open up her own brick and mortar instance. She and her business partner, Lauren Garrity, have been amazingly successful in a variety of different ways. Flannery was in my kitchen one day and getting ready for a party we were holding, and I saw her, what I now know to be, honing her knives. And I said to her, Flannery, why are you sharpening your knives? Why do you sharpen your knives before every time you cook? And she said, in a very sassy way, I like to say that Flannery is a sailor and a chef, and so the number of F-bombs that come out are relatively with some frequency. So she said, Steve, I'm not sharpening my knife, I'm honing it. And I was like, what's the difference, Flannery? And she's like, honing is just realigning the steel on your knife so it cuts the way the last time you sharpened it. Sharpening actually removes steel from the blade. And when you remove steel from the blade, you make it more brittle, more likely to break. You don't want to sharpen your knife too frequently, right? You want to keep it sharp, but that's what honing's for. And so that resonated, I think I shared that story with Geoff. And what our observation was that business leaders had become really reliant on transformation. And they would sort of let their organization get dull, and then they just decide to transform it. And they let it get dull, and then they transform it again. And we're seeing a lot of transformation fatigue. And we're also seeing that transformations too frequently fail. Geoff and I aren't anti-transformation, because we think, and very consistent with your work, we think that when competitive advantage erodes, you must transform your organization. But we prefer those instances to be rare, kind of like amputation in medicine, and absolutely necessary because they couldn't be foreseen. And we think too often transformation is the result of not having honed your organization over time, rather than something that was just unforeseeable and happened to you. So even today, people talk about how quickly the onslaught of AI has come. Well, the so-called ChatGPT moment of was already 3 years ago.
Right.
Right. We're not like it's been a while so far that we're in this LLM period. And by the way, AI had been around for quite a while. There was
Absolutely.
just an interview on CNBC talking about with a leader of a major private equity, some investment that they made in 2018, 2019 around AI. So this is not a new phenomenon, but it's sort of the fact that we haven't been keeping up has been part of the issue here.
Mhm. Did you want to add anything, Geoff?
No, that's a good summary. That's kind of the arc of the story of where we've landed. And I think it's easy, especially if you just hear the subjects of the books at a surface level, to say, well, hold on, you started off with blowing everything up, and now you've got this light touch, hone something every single day. And actually, we have come full circle, but back to the same idea, and that is that you still need to do small controlled demolitions all the time. That actually can be part of honing. It does, and it doesn't have to be explosive and disruptive, but actually getting rid of things and removing management systems that don't work anymore and that aren't fit for purpose is exactly what we intended to signal and detonate. And so I think we both feel very good that with Hone, we've landed in a place with this trilogy where we have a very practical set of solutions for every leader to be able to use every single day, and a slightly different look at a theory of organizational change that we think actually is a better way of going about it.
Yeah, and I'm kind of with you on that. The use of management systems, I think, is something people don't think about enough. And the idea of thinking in systems is something that I just continually find senior leaders wrestle with. So, part of the subtitle of the book is How Purposeful Leaders Defy Drift. So for those of you joining us, I'm talking with Geoff and Steve about their great book, Home, the third of a series of books about how organizations can cope with uncertainty and sort of turbulence. And I've made the argument for years, which I think is consistent with your thesis, that if we start treating change as the normal thing and not as the weird thing, we would operate very differently. We would make lots of continuous small changes, as I think you're suggesting, rather than waiting for a crisis to come and then all of a sudden we've got to make some massive change and fire the left-hand side of the building. And that stuff is so destructive. It is just so destructive. So one of the things I'd love you to elaborate on is this whole concept of a management system. And I forget whose wife it was, but somebody had this horrible experience renewing a driver's license.
That was Steve's. That was Michelle, Steve's wife.
Was it Steve's wife? I was just, my heart was just aligned with that story, because how many times have we been in a situation where the system is just not designed to deliver the result that anybody wants, even the people working in the system, right?
Well, so that's a design. I mean, that's a design. It's a design flaw, and I think Geoff and I both, as you know, are sort of fans of the concept of design in general in business, and the observation that we have, and I think it bears. We're using the term management system. It bears. I think it would be helpful to your listeners to just take a slight detour and say, like, what are we talking about? Because it's it's not just data systems.
No.
Management systems comes from the strategy choice cascade, and as you know, Rita, we've both been disciples of Roger Martin with our work at Monitor over the years. Management systems is the fifth box of the choice cascade. It's the pinky toe of strategy.
Maybe just describe the 5 blocks for people that might not be familiar.
Sure. So
why didn't I describe the 5, and then we got to land with Steve explaining management systems, because Rita, I got to share with you and all your listeners. Steve actually had a shirt made that said, "My strategy includes management systems," and he wears it not infrequently. So the concept behind the strategy choice cascade is that good strategy entails making choices. You have to choose to do something and choose not to do something else. And it's a good strategy is an interwoven set of choices that can be bucketed into 5 categories that when you see the choice cascade displayed, it actually looks like a set of 5 cascading boxes that have a linear flow, but they have interconnections, and it's all a very recursive exercise, because when you make a choice upstream in the choice cascade, it trickles down. When you make a choice downstream in the choice cascade, it trickles up, et cetera. So the first box in the choice cascade is goals and aspirations. You need to be able to make some choices about what you're trying to achieve, either from an economic perspective or from an overall mission perspective. And this can be applied, by the way, at the corporate level, at a business unit level, at a functional level. It's a very flexible way of thinking about strategy. So goals and aspirations is the first box. The second box is, or second cluster of choices, is all around where you play in the market. So typically that entails which markets, which geographies you're going to play in, which segments of customers, maybe what product categories, et cetera. Third box is how to win. So the business models that you need to be able to deploy to play in those markets and hopefully win more than your fair share of the business that you're competing for. The fourth box is the capabilities you need to actually execute on that winning strategy. So the business models that you've chosen to work with. And then the fifth box, as Steve said, the pinky toe of the choice cascade, are the management systems that you need to enable the entire flow. And so, Steve, with that, I'll hand it over to you to go deeper on management systems, because the premise behind Hone is actually that is both the most overlooked collection of choices in the choice cascade often, but it's probably the most powerful.
Yeah, well, what's going on? And just for our listeners, before you go, Steve, so a lot of this is described in Roger Martin's book with A.G. Lafley called Playing to Win. So for those of you that have an interest in getting deeper into this topic, there's a little reference for you. So Steve, go ahead.
No, and it is a great overview of it. And just one of the things that Geoff described that was super important was, the recursive nature of this, that you have to go back and forth. I think even Roger would say after writing Playing to Win that that people still sort of treat it as this linear set of choices. But what in my experience, what they almost always do when applying it on their own is they just ignore management systems. They literally just say, like, we didn't have time to do the last box, or we didn't have time to do the last few boxes.
I hear that all the time. Absolutely. Yeah. It's like, we didn't have time to get around to the compensation system. Well, duh.
Right. And so Rita, having spent nearly a decade as our chief strategy officer inside Deloitte, what I came to appreciate in trying to drive a strategy change, which is described in Hone, the thing that matters the most is management systems inside every organization, because when you talk about actually enacting strategy, like making it real as opposed to just something on a PowerPoint, the thing that makes the difference between that strategy being real and behave and driving different behaviors of the people in your organization is all the things that fall into that fifth box. It's your evaluation systems, how you budget, how you compensate people, as you just said. It's those formal systems. It's also the informal systems. It's the questions that leaders ask in meetings. It's the questions, that, as you said earlier in our conversation, what do people expect of me? What does good look like around here? How do I think I get promoted? Like, not like what it says in my evaluation sheet, but like what really matters. Like, don't tell me about the stuff that's in there.
And
Geoff,
Steve,
you look like you want to jump in.
It's probably worth just doing a pause for a definition. A management system, in our definition, the way we think about it, is anything that drives human behavior within the organization, outside the organization. And it's, yes, we have a set of management systems that we name in the book, but there are going to be different management systems for different organizations based on what drives people's behavior within the organization.
Right. And we started calling it the nervous system of strategy, right? If Roger is fond of saying where to play, how to win is the heart of strategy. So management systems are the nervous system of strategy. It makes the world work. And the problem is you can't, what you want is real world change to how you behave when you enact a strategy, you must therefore change your management systems. And what we found is that all management systems affect behavior. And oftentimes it's the stuff that people don't think of as very strategic that is preventing the changes in behavior that are required to change strategy. So when you combine all of these things, which is the concept of we must continuously change in order to avoid drifting away from where we want to go and the knife dulling. The tool of the leader who wants to hone is actually continually changing your management systems to promote slightly different behavior to stay relevant in your marketplace. And given that conclusion, we also conclude that therefore the CEO must be the chief system designer, because it's how all the management systems work together that drives behavior. Now, we don't think that CEOs need to be like deep into the details of every single management system inside their organization, but she needs to be the one who kind of understands the most important systems and how they work together and can delegate some of the detailed design. But she can't just declare, this is my strategy, someone else go implement it, because that, in our experience, just doesn't work. It gets discombobulated really quickly and ends up not driving the behavior that they want.
Mm-hmm. I would totally endorse that, and I would agree. I think there's a lot of people that just don't think it all the way through. If I want strategy X, and yet I'm rewarding. I mean, Steve Kerr's famous article on the folly of hoping for A while rewarding B, right? And you just see that all the time. So when I look at CEOs who've been successful, one of the things that does strike me, and I think it's reflected in this book, Hone, is their relentlessness. They're just absolutely, this is what we're doing. It's Monday, so therefore this is what we're doing. And by the way, we haven't changed the focus of what we're doing on Tuesday. And it's very impressive, the energy and the relentlessness that they put to it.
Well, you can call it relentlessness, or you can, and I know it probably differs by individual. You can just call it clear-eyed focus on the change you're trying to achieve. And I think the business lore would suggest, and not all business lore, but business lore would suggest that the best CEOs, the most visionary CEOs, are the ones that had the grand, bold visions for what they wanted to do with their company. They declared a direction, they declared a market they were going to go take over, and everything else happened. And we've been I think taught, either formally and informally, that the best leaders are those that are the visionary leaders that can go and declare a certain direction for the company. And I think we actually see that manifesting in a lot of ways senior leaders, CEOs act in companies. They think they've taken in over time, just given the way that we've grown up as a business society, that it's their job to be the visionary and let everyone else go and do the execution. So the ones that are relentless, that have that clear-eyed visions, are the ones that do exactly what Steve described before. Not necessarily control every single system, but ask people in the organization, ask their direct reports, what are the behaviors that you're trying to drive? What are the actions that you're taking with your management systems under your control to drive those behaviors? What are we trying to do in the market? How are we using all of the management systems at our disposal to create that behavioral change? And that can feel relentless, but it is at least a march forward in the right direction.
I didn't mean relentless in a negative way. I just mean
no. I didn't take it that way, but it's
their focus is amazing. Like Lasse Narsson, who I greatly admire, he's the CEO of Novartis, and he made a really interesting observation. He said that he sees one of his roles as quite literally providing the energy for the organization by the questions he asks, by the meetings he holds, by the relentless focus on. And I mean, from the strategy point of view, Novartis has been super interesting because unlike many of the sort of pharma companies of the past, which would have, yes, a pharmaceutical division and then a consumer division and then maybe an off-brand division. And he said, no, we're going for innovative medicines, and has kind of, over the years he's been in office, really realigned the whole organization around that premise. So you really see the connection between the strategy and what he's trying to achieve. And he talks about a culture of being curious, inspired, and unbossed. And it's just relentless how they've been driving those things through the company. Very, very interesting. Well, so for our leaders, I just wanted to read one of the things that really struck me from the book, which was the same that any executive in any organization. So this is page 118 for those of you who are listening. The executive in any organization should be able to take as they drive change. So this, whether you're the janitor or whether you're the CEO. So identify the actors in the system, articulate the outcome you want to achieve, identify the behavior changes for the actors in the system that will produce the desired outcome, identify the motivators for behavior change for each actor or group of actors, identify and act on the management systems that trigger those motivations, and then hone the system over time. And the reason I just wanted to take a minute to read that is it's so clear, right? I mean, it's very prescriptive, and it's very kind of, yeah, I could do that.
Yeah.
You know, and I could do that at my school cafeteria. I could do that arranging the bus journey. I could do that, if I'm organizing a science project. So, I mean, very, very kind of clear articulation of what actions you could take.
Well, it's interesting that. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Geoff.
I was just going to say, at first, I'm glad it's clear. At second, I think the readers will probably find that in a different place in the book with the actual final print, because the page numbers will have changed and what have you. But it is. I'm first of all, thank you for saying it was clear. I'm glad. I'm glad that it came across that way, and it sounds, at least to us, logical. Like, why wouldn't everyone do that? But think about how often in our day-to-day lives in business or whatever business you're in, we spend thinking about human behavioral change. Okay, because at the heart of everything you just named right there, you can't do any of the rest of the stuff unless you know what behavior you're driving for. And it actually ends up, most of the time when we have these conversations with our clients, it's a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction, if ever, a normal part of someone's day to think about the human behaviors that you're trying to change, either inside the organization or outside the organization. And so I'm glad it was clear. It may sound straightforward, but it's actually really difficult to do, because we're not geared as organizations to allow people the time and the reflection and the curiosity, to use the adjective that you mentioned before, to go and explore behavioral change. Mm-hmm. Steve, you and I started talking at the same time. You may have gone in a different direction.
And I wasn't going to go in a different direction. I was going to point out sort of, Rita, I'm sure you've experienced this, is after you write a book, and a book is one of those, unfortunately quite static things in the world where it's printed and effectively laminated. There is something that I've been thinking about a lot that doesn't come into play in the way we talk about, but I do think it's important for listeners to appreciate, which is all of those steps are the right steps you need to go through. However, there's always a variable that we ignore in management, and that's just the importance of time. So you talked about relentless leadership and repeat and a repetitive message. We talk about figuring out the drivers and the barriers and the motivators of behavior, but all of those things aren't instantaneous. Mm-hmm. And I think there's, to some extent, either a orthodoxy or an expectation or some cognitive barrier that we have as human beings, that we expect as soon as we start acting, that the behavior change will come. Mm-hmm. And there's often a delay in the time it takes for that action to result in a behavior change. It's like not all chemical reactions are instantaneous. And certainly not all, if you start working out, just because you lift weights one day doesn't mean you're going to look like a bodybuilder the next day. It takes lots and lots of repeat and relentlessness, as you say. And so I think that there's an important element of time that it takes to drive that behavior change that needs to be baked into how people expect it to come. And there's an impatience in a lot of organizations where they declare that something isn't working, before it may have had enough time to actually play the way through the system. So if I would hone our message a little bit, it would be do all the things that you read, and also give it the appropriate time to have the impact that you want it to have.
Mm-hmm. I love that message. And you had mentioned that in the book you talk about the change that you were working through with Deloitte, and I thought that was quite brave, to be able to do that. What were some of the sort of key learnings from having gone through that experience? Because you've got this massive company with full of super bright people who all think they know the best about, they're all subject matter experts, and they think they know the best.
Steve had the most fun job in the world, being the chief strategy officer for a bunch of people who thought they knew strategy. So, exactly. but he really drove the journey. So, Steve, you should comment on that.
Well, I will just say I will start with we didn't include Deloitte because we think we got it perfect, or we knew in advance, or
You said that in the book.
yeah, or even we probably had something called the transformation program. But as I looked back on it, we were actually we were never doing anything that was so disruptive to our business. We were making massive amounts of change. What we were doing is honing over time, making change. And look, there's a pragmatic reason why we write about Deloitte is like we generally don't want to write about our clients because we enjoy very private relationships with them. So we thought we can be a good example. I will just say the story about this that I'd like to that I would share is what we learned over time was we think our secret sauce is the ability to bring all the capabilities that we have under our roof together for our clients, because there's no operating model in the world that can preordain solve the complex and new changes without constantly shifting, and that's just impractical. And so what we had to learn how to do was, how is it that we assemble the capabilities in some kind of either pre-configured way where it's a new and knowable change, like Geoff and I are doing in sustainability, or how do we, how do we think about doing that on a customized basis when we've got a novel client need that we haven't seen before, and we have to figure out how to do these piece parts together. When I first got the role, I thought, well, this is obvious. We could be so distinctive, we could be so different. And what I came to appreciate was how hard it was to promote that behavior in a organization that had pretty strong management systems about the offers we had and the businesses we were in. We had a strategy for a long time that grew us very successfully from about the turn of the century for the next 15 years, about building up world-class businesses, and in particular, our consulting practice, which was small-ish as of 2000, and has grown significantly, particularly in the domains of technology, and we acquired Monitor and strategy, and so we've got a big broad-based consulting services practice. And then it says, I don't think that there's another pillar to grow on, so we've got to do more with what we've got. And that's where the idea for the differentiation came. But then it took a lot of honing to be able to get to a place, and we're still doing it, where we can assemble the piece parts together for our clients. So challenges that are broad and gnarly, like finance transformation, or like I said, sustainability and infrastructure, or how do you think about helping a client deploy AI en masse across their organization? That's not one thing, that's many different capabilities that cut across all of the different things that sit in our businesses.
And Steve, we should probably just clarify for those that either haven't read Hone or don't know Deloitte, what Steve's talking about here with the differentiation is, once we built up those super strong pillars of businesses, consulting, audit and assurance, and tax services, which are our three main businesses today, the key point of differentiation was then, okay, now let's get partners within each of those different businesses going to market together and looking for ways to bring value by combining the businesses, not just working to create world-class businesses in and of themselves. And so that really, the journey that we were on and continue to be on was primarily for the purpose of doing that, which sounds, again, for anyone that doesn't live within the organization or understand the way big private professional services firms operate, it sounds like of course. But unless you have the management systems in place to compel people to actually value that and to do that, and not just think about their small part of the business, it's really difficult to achieve.
Oh, I think this is one of the uber challenges of just how you organize, because quite unintentionally, what happens is a lot of these systems favor the optimization of a part at the expense of the whole. So one of my favorite examples of this is Sony, which for many years Sony had all these different divisions that did all these different things, but they were rewarded for doing the best for their divisions. So if you think about Sony movies, right, you could have had the Sony gaming and the Sony the other parts of Sony really benefiting from the creativity that went into the Sony movies. But because the Sony movies business was rewarded for maximizing its revenue or profits, what they did was they licensed out all their characters and all their genius stuff to other game makers. So it kind of eliminated Sony's potential advantage in that market. They could have had a unique position, and they just kind of lost it.
But it's easy to look at these things in retrospect and say, well, that was a bad choice. But in the moment, it can feel like it's the right choice and perfectly on strategy. So one of the reflections that Steve and I had in Hone is, and you mentioned this earlier, we've kind of made mention of it before, but we both spent a long time. I've actually spent my entire career at a strategy consulting firm called Monitor Group. It was one of the original pure play strategy firms. It's now part of Deloitte. But in the years right before we ended up selling to Deloitte, we had a set of management systems that were exactly on strategy for what Monitor was trying to do to encourage collaboration by bringing other, kind of actually what we're talking about is the strategy of Deloitte today, bring others to client meetings, bring a breadth of experience to make sure everything we did was around helping companies grow, to make sure that we could help clients grow in a whole variety of different ways. And so we had a management system in place where there was limitless sharing of revenue, meaning at the end of the year when you get your assessment, everyone, if you can bring 5 partners, if it's a $10 million project, you've got 5 partners involved in it, all 5 get credit for that $10 million. Exactly the right thing to do to drive collaboration. But lo and behold, if you've got limitless double counting across the system, there's no motivation to actually go out and drive new business and to grow. And so actually one of the things that was perfect for achieving one of the aspects of our strategy was actually quite imperfect for driving profits. And that was not the only reason, but certainly one reason why we had to look for a strategic relationship somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great observation, because I do find that getting experts to collaborate is really hard. I mean, another example that comes to mind is if you look at the Mayo Clinic, right? They take a whole person perspective and they bring in the necessary specialists, and it's not like each specialist on its own. And I've recently, unfortunately, had some major encounters with another medical system which does not operate that way. And oh my God, you get handed from specialist to specialist to specialist, and they're like, well, my piece of the person's okay. There's nothing to see here. And I'm like, nobody owns the problem.
Yeah.
It's really frustrating.
And Rita, I actually want to come back to your and with that example, ask you a question if it's okay, because I'd love to tap into your thinking. So one of the things that Geoff and I are fond of doing in our books is talking about minimally viable thoughts. Mm-hmm. And one of the thoughts that I've been having of late, and we haven't articulated this yet, Geoff, is given the tendencies of businesses that look and feel like conglomerates, right? With multiple different business units with perhaps questionable synergies between them that are just part of common ownership. And we see the size and scale of businesses today, and sometimes what happens, and this doesn't always happen, but I think it happens with some frequency, is that the bigger and the more complex you get, the harder it is for you to do things like Hone. And so I'm wondering, like, do you think there are clear diseconomies of scale? And to what extent, when do you start to see the benefits of scale, start to erode, and at what are the signs that you might be experiencing massive diseconomies of scale, and what can a leader do to feel like, okay, maybe what I need to do is actually make my organization smaller rather than larger to be more successful?
Interesting. Well, there was just a piece on this, and I'll have to dig up the reference for you, but the author and academic delved into the business logic, the economic logic of having a diversified business that was sort of anti-seasonal or whatever. And he said, look, it just doesn't work, because what you got is a struggling business. And even if you match it with a growing business, you still got a liability in terms of your market cap. So a couple of interesting examples, right? General Electric, which is the canonical diversified firm, now broken up into 3 firms, and they're all growing now. You've got Novartis, which was, and all the other pharmas have spun off their consumer product businesses. So here's where I think that fits in the sort of 30,000 foot vision. I think we're in the middle of this massive transition from the mass manufacturing, cheap energy, suburbs, highways, housing, Cold War fueled sort of collection of technologies. And we're very clearly in this turning point to a world that's much more digital, where the geopolitics have changed dramatically, where the sort of agreement about what a good economic system looks like that we created after World War II, I think that's all in the midst of being questioned. And part of that questioning, to me, is how big does a company need to be? Because if you look at digital products, right, we've now got our first single person unicorn, a guy who sold the game to Microsoft for over $1 billion. And so if the unit of value creation is becoming increasingly small teams or even individuals, then the benefit of having a large diversified portfolio is much less, I think. And if you think about building a company that was fit for mass production, so take Ford, the original inventor of this whole mass production idea. If you're not mass producing, if you're producing customized, personalized digital products for individual people, then the benefit that you have of the overhang of, as you said, these massive management systems that now need to be kind of brought up to speed, I think that benefit starts to decline dramatically. And I think the overhead cost of just maintaining the systems is harder. And so I think what happens in a large company, and we've seen this when you look at firms that have gone into decline, like deep, dark death experiences, something like the American tire industry or Sears, what you find is the number of people that are focused on just maintaining internal systems versus, as you talked about, looking outside, growing, and so forth, just gets larger and larger as the system gets bigger. So you do see that pattern. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's some benefit to focusing. In fact, I was talking to some people at Novartis who were talking about a specific case of, okay, so we've got Sandoz and we've got Novartis, and we have to decide where we're going to invest to put plant expansion, right? And I mean, it's a fairly straightforward decision. So am I going to put it into pharmaceutical manufacturing? Am I going to put it into making, aspirin or whatever it is they're selling? And if you have those two companies together, you've got this incredibly difficult conversation because there's no logical way to break that impasse. Whereas if the two companies are separate and and Novartis has now made its bet on innovative medicine, and that that's what you're doing, then the choice becomes obvious. So I think there's a whole cluster of things that having a diversified company with lots of overhead, it's a drag, right? It's a drag on your performance.
So it is a fascinating question. I kind of fear Steve may have just introduced the idea for a fourth book that we promised ourselves we were not going to do, but who knows? But as I listened to your very compelling explanation, Rita, I do wonder what's at the heart of that. And I bet that part of it is that digital is driving the nature of fixed cost down dramatically, so that the value of amortizing fixed costs across a more and more scaled organization no longer exists. I mean, that ultimately was one of the reasons why scale mattered in the early days. And as we get more digitally enabled and cost structures shift, that if that advantage goes away, then you're right. You can start. You can certainly be a lot more nimble as a smaller organization. You can start actually operating in a different way.
And I think, but the thing that I would say though in that is that the other tension is that software and digitization is itself a fixed cost, and so the benefits of scale happen really fast in digital businesses, and the question is, to what extent can you disrupt a juggernaut that is built on super high margin businesses because of the fixed cost nature of that. So there's this tension, which is it's easier to disrupt because it's cheaper if you come up with a better mousetrap, because software tends to be cheaper than putting physical capital in the ground. However, if you get out to a really big lead, the motivation to try to drive it. So there's these tensions. One is the one you say, or you said, Geoff, and two is the one that I'm saying. And where do those trains meet? It's definitely something distinctive for each different market, and based on, can I change the behavior, or is it become a habit? Has it become a habit that's so hard to change that you can't do it? And we're going to see that play out. By the way, I think it'll be very interesting to see the legacy search players versus the upstart, LLM players, and see how that plays out. I think that'll be an interesting experiment in that way that we should watch with interest.
Well, Steve, I saw you jump out of your chair with that dimension of that $1 billion game, which I don't know what it is, but you were obviously very excited about it. Do you have the game or something? Do you know what it is?
What?
When Rita mentioned the game that was sold for $1 billion, you react.
I had my microphone still on mute. And Rita, it was funny you said that. Geoff and I were at an executive education experience together, and one of the questions we were debating with the professor was, at what point would there be the first $1 billion single person startup? And the participants were like, oh, maybe 2027, and we kept pushing it earlier and earlier, and then and apparently I hadn't heard that news, and that you broke the bet. You broke the news.
This was actually a couple of years ago. This was, and I'm blanking on the name of the game, but it was a game that Microsoft wanted so badly that they paid over $1 billion for it. So one of the things that I think is interesting now is this tendency for digital markets to go winner take all, which I think is what you were just alluding to, Steve. And that's tough. I mean, that's like the new economies of scale. But like at the same time, what I'm seeing is companies are sort of devolving into these like ecosystems almost. It's almost as though you're creating small teams of value creators who are sort of linked together through a common set of norms. And that may be part of the new management system of the future, which is, how do I and my partners interact and work together? I
would say almost by definition, that's going to have to be the case, because if we theorize that companies are going to become smaller and more nimble, they're not going to have the full range of capabilities to solve the problems that customers have, that people have for whatever they're trying to buy the service. And therefore, by definition, they're going to have to band together to try to achieve anything that isn't like a pure play solution. There will be some companies that have pure play solutions for a very, very specific need, but it's almost inevitable that we're going to have to work better as ecosystems to solve the really hard problems. I mean, this is what Steve and I run into every single day in our day jobs around sustainability.
Well, and I think what you've learned with the putting the Deloitte partners in more collaborative mode is also relevant to ecosystems. So let's pick up on sustainability, because I do believe part of this huge transition, right, that we're in, is that we don't have 8 planets to burn. We're going to have to figure this out. And sort of toward the end of the book, you talk about the challenges you're facing in sustainability. And I would argue that the way we've framed these sustainability choices is often very off-putting to people, because who voluntarily wakes up in the morning and says, great, today I'm going to use less energy and do less stuff and take a colder shower, or whatever it is you're asking me to sacrifice. I think what we need is a move towards seeing sustainable practices as actually sexy and desirable. So if I take a historical analogy, right, back in the day, food, if you think about mass market food, think the kinds of things that Kraft Heinz would produce, right? That was considered to be like the hot new great thing. And you had Women's Day magazines talking about how you could use Jell-O in salads and stuff like that. I mean, we look at that today with a set of tastes informed by, now we've got Whole Foods Market, now we've got organic at scale, now we've got these things that are more sustainable, but they're also seen as more desirable. And so I think where a lot of the sustainability people have gone wrong is that just framing it in terms of, we have to have no growth, and we have to give up stuff, and we can't. I just think we need a more positive way of looking at it. I'd love to pick your brains on that.
Yeah, Rita, I would say I agree with it, and with what you're saying, and I would build on it. I think I've had the privilege of having the leadership role of our sustainability and infrastructure business for a few years now, but I was not a long time, sustainability person. So I'm learning about this space all the time. And Geoff has forgotten more than I'll ever know about the energy system. So when we get to energy, we'll go to him. But the one observation that I would make about the movement writ large over time, going back to the 90s, is the message has always been the same core message, which has been primarily a moral message and primarily a message of fear. And I think, like if we're applying the principles of Hone to this world, it's like there are different segments of the population who have different motivators of their behavior around sustainability. For some, the message that has been the core message is sufficient to motivate behavior change. But unfortunately, that is a very small percentage of the population. And if I was being critical, what the sustainability movement has not done is diversified the number of messages to reach new and different segments. So to grow, we have to have different messages that resonate with different segments of the population. And by the way, it's not like one behavior. It's like your food choices are very different than your driving choices, than your energy need choices, and so it's a super complicated problem. What we think is that overall sustainability is just a good business choice. It has the ability to reduce cost, to reduce risk. We're doing, we're doing a lot looking at the risks of climate disasters on just business continuity risk and supply chains. And as you point out, in some cases, it can enhance revenue with your positioning. But I think that the overall message is like you have to decouple it. So for a lot of companies, there's a ton of value that can be created just by thinking about your supply chain in a more circular nature, or removing waste, removing unnecessary spend. And as I'm sure Geoff will point out, that in every company in the future is going to need to be an energy company, and one of the fastest ways to deploy new energy, given permitting and supply chains, is actually in the renewable space, and it also in many cases is the cheapest type of energy that you can deploy. So I think the broad-based point I'd make, and then I'd see what Geoff wants to add to, is we can't think of this as like one message. We have to say, like, what will resonate and for what reason with different segments. And sometimes it's, if you're talking to a skeptical CFO, it's like, this is about cost and ROI, and we're going to show how we can drive it. This is about reducing risk. And sometimes with consumers, maybe there is a way to make it more sexy, but I think that there are many different aspects of this that just make it a good business decision. But Geoff, what would you add?
I think that ultimately is the punchline, Steve. Unlike Steve, I have dabbled in sustainability my entire career, going all the way back to my undergrad minor. And this is my third attempt to help a professional services firm serve a sustainability market. My two previous attempts, it was at Monitor. I tried to start a sustainability business, and both times we shut it down because people weren't willing to pay. It's just a reality. No matter what they say, yes, there's a small segment somewhere that's willing to pay a price premium for green goods, but no matter what people say, they're not going to pay extra, except for that small segment. And let's just accept that as a reality. What's different today is the economics are shifting, both the actual economics of the way the value chains operate, and I do almost all of my work in the energy space, so that's particularly true there, as Steve just referenced, but also the way that we think about economics and the way we frame economics. And that's why, in many ways, this topic is a great thread through all of our different books, because if we can look at risk differently and actually think about monetizing risk differently, then there are different economics to our business than we've thought about historically. So as we look at energy projects, for example, that struggle getting off the ground in some clean energy systems, one of the reasons for that is the project developers can't get financing because the capital providers think about their risk profile and the way they mitigate risk in very old school terms. So what they expect for the project developers, you need to go and find someone on the demand side that will sign a 10-year contract at a set price where there's guaranteed revenue flows. And the reality is for new energy innovations, for any sort of innovations, usually the cost structure is not yet in place, and the price that they're able to sell something is not sufficiently compelling that they're going to be able to go get a 10-year contract. And so what you get is this chicken and egg problem where no one's willing to move first. But if you can actually think about monetizing that differently, striking different types of contracts, think about the value of risk in a different way than we have historically, blow up the playbooks, going back to Detonate, of how we thought about managing down risk, then we actually may see some progress. And the good news is companies are starting to do that. They're starting to actually work better in ecosystems, and we are seeing the economic shift towards it being a better decision in many situations to actually go the sustainable route than to go the traditional route. The final thing I'll say on this, Nit, I actually do believe that what's happening with our energy system is actually driving the vast majority of what we're seeing around sustainability opportunities for any type of company out there, because as Steve said before, every company either uses or produces energy in the world. They need it for what they do, and so therefore they're wrapped up in that system. Going back to Provoke, our book, and the idea that uncertainties shift from being a question of if to being a question of when, we are no longer wondering whether we need to transition the nature of our energy system. We will not, if you fast forward the clock 30, 40, 50 years, we will not have an energy system that is primarily dependent on fossil fuels. We just won't. I mean, it's a reality. It doesn't mean that they're going to go away completely. It doesn't mean they should go away completely. But in order to serve the vast and explosively growing needs that we have for power, whether it's to provide power to data centers to fuel AI or just growth generally, we're going to need all sorts of new energy to come online. And therefore, if we stop acting as if it's a choice whether or not to deploy new energy systems and just say, look, it's happening, we might as well go ahead with it and get going, then we have an opportunity, anyone, to create new sources of advantage early in that cycle. And we still are, the energy, whether you call it the energy transition or the energy evolution, whatever it is, we're still reasonably early days at it. It is going to take decades to unfold, but we have to act now as companies in that space if we want to create advantage for ourselves.
I love that. And that is, I think, a very nice optimistic note to bring us to a conclusion of this conversation. So for those of you that may just have been joining us at the last minute, my guests are the author of this great new book, Hone, Geoff Tuff and Steve Goldbach. And I want to say thank you so much for spending some time with us. And I've really enjoyed talking to you.
Yeah, thank you. That was fun.
We'll pick this up in the future. I think we should.
We can do it, Rita. We're only a few blocks away from each other, so we can have.
And I'll hop it on the subway and haul it up to the Upper West Side to see you both.
All right, I'll hold you to that, guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
All right,
Rita.
thank you.
It's been a pleasure.